Thank you, Colbie, and welcome everyone. My name is Christine Kirby. I am the Assistant Commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection for the Bureau of Air and Waste. And I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to MassDEP's 5th stakeholder meeting as we continue to gather your input and use that input for developing new provisions for including cumulative impact analysis, or shorthand called CIA, into certain categories of air quality permits. Up until now and to date, we've had 4 sets of stakeholder meetings on this topic. And this meeting and tomorrow night's meeting continues a very important process for us at MassDEP and for the Commonwealth. As you may have noticed, MassDEP is quite committed to a robust process to ensure that all stakeholders with an interest in this process and the regulations we ultimately propose later this year, making sure that you're all engaged in this process. Next slide, please. So today we'll be presenting information on the cumulative impact analysis process. And we will also be reporting back on the evaluation of the indicators we discussed at our meetings in November, including indicators in the environmental category, public health, and also socioeconomic indicators, all of which may be used in the cumulative impact analysis. The evaluation of the indicators have included your input during our November stakeholder meetings. And today the speakers are going to, as we go through our presentation, the speakers are going to pause periodically, as we have done in the past, throughout the presentation to see if there are any questions or if you have anything you would like to discuss as part of the presentation. And I've noticed we've had quite a few folks joining. I'm really encouraged by that. We've been pleased at the level of participation at our meetings, the previous 4 and the one today. So as Colbie said, at any time during the presentation, if you do have a question, please don't hesitate to use the raise hand function or indicate that you have a question in the chat and ERG will bring it to our attention. Next slide, please. So this slide shows where we are in the process. MassDEP started holding monthly stakeholder meetings last August 2021. Our plan is to propose regulations by October for public comment. And today we will begin discussions on the CIA process and the plan to have discussions of the various elements of the CIA framework in March and April at our stakeholder meetings that we will schedule then. Of note, we will not be holding a meeting in February. We have a lot of work to do, so we want to use that time to get ready for our March and April stakeholder sessions. And we do hope to have an outline of the regulations for input this summer in 2022, well in advance of the proposed regulations by October. Next slide. So why are we here? This slide shows Governor Baker. He signed a new climate law on March 26, 2021, and it became effective on June 26th of 2021. Next slide, please. So in terms of the climate law and what it directed MassDEP to do, it directs MassDEP to evaluate and seek public comment on incorporating cumulative impact analyses into certain permits. These are air permits, and to propose regulations within 18 months requiring cumulative impact analysis in certain air permits. And as you know, the climate law directs MassDEP to incorporate that analysis into certain air permits by the end of this year, propose regulations through a public engagement and comment process. So we are well on our way in terms of meeting that requirement under the climate law. The climate law also had separate requirements for MEPA, the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act. On this, as shown on this side, we're not going to go over that today, but that's for your review. So to wrap up my piece, we appreciate your partnership in exploring this complex topic. We have reached out to the environmental stakeholder community, municipalities, regulated community, environmental and business organizations, and especially environmental justice, communities with environmental justice populations and organizations to participate in this process. And we're glad to see you again here today. Again, we have had great participation. So thank you for that. And I'll turn it over to Glenn Keith, the Director of the Air and Climate Division at MassDEP, to give an overview of the CIA process. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. So what I wanted to do next was just provide a fairly high level overview of what the cumulative impact analysis process may look like. Next slide. So you can see in this graphic that there's several steps that could be part of this analysis. So I want to just touch on each of these, and then we'll discuss some of these steps in further slides, especially at the front end of the steps. But first, our thought was that we've certainly heard loud and clear from the input from you all so far that community involvement and engagement is critical to the cumulative impact analysis. So we've taken that to heart, and we think step one would involve a pre-application community notice and engagement requirement, so that prior to even submitting an application for a air permit to MassDEP, the applicant, proponent of a project, would need to notify the community about the project and then engage with the community to find out what their concerns are. And we already do some of that for some of our air permits for environmental justice communities, where we require applicants to prepare an environmental justice fact sheet. So this would be building off that, and as well as the MEPA process has issued a public involvement protocol that was effective this past January 1st, 2022, that also requires prior to filing a ENF or an EIR to reach out to the community. So we think that makes sense in this situation as well. Then the second step would be for the applicant to assess baseline community conditions. And this is where they would look at the environmental, health, and socioeconomic indicators to get a sense of the existing conditions in the community. And later on in the presentation, APT, the consultant that's working with us, will report back on where we are in terms of looking at those indicators and evaluating them. But this would form the basis for putting together what's the situation in the community, and this baseline would also be informed by the community engagement. The applicant would then analyze the cumulative impacts of the existing and added air pollution, as well as look at some of the other indicators. And this is really the heart of the cumulative impact analysis, trying to look at how this proposed air permit would affect the community and what those impacts are. And then the remaining steps are similar to what we do today. The applicant would file a permit application. This would include the cumulative impact analysis with the application, and so that would be a new thing. And at that point, we would notify the public, the affected community, that an application has been submitted and that the cumulative impact analysis is available for review by the community, and encourage the community to provide any comments they have to MassDEP. This comment period would be informal, and it would inform MassDEP as we review the application and the cumulative impact analysis. And then the next step would be for MassDEP to propose a permit decision based on the permit application and the cumulative impact analysis, as well as any community comments. And then that would go out to a formal public comment period, similar to many of our permits today. And at the end of the comment period, MassDEP would issue a decision. So these are the steps that we think could be make sense for the cumulative impact analysis. We'll just walk through some of these steps. Next slide, please. So again, in terms of the community engagement piece, we've heard clearly that community engagement is an important part. So in terms of the pre-application community notice and engagement, prior to submitting the permit application, the applicant would notify MassDEP as well as the affected community about the proposed project. And this could include local officials as well as community-based organizations. Under the current MIPA EJ community engagement process, there's a requirement to notify the community, and there would be envisioned there a list provided by the EEA EJ director who could help identify some of these community-based organizations. So something perhaps similar could work here. But the point is to let the community know well in advance of permit application that an application will be submitted and that a cumulative impact analysis will be conducted. We already today encourage any applicant to have a pre-application with our air permitting folks in the appropriate region prior to submitting an application about any proposed project. So that would be also encouraged here or possibly required in the regulations. We would want to meet with the applicant to make sure that they understand what's required of them in terms of the cumulative impact analysis and find out what kind of community engagement plans they have. We could probably have guidance on this. I know under the MIPA process, they have at least a checklist that they've developed for the prior notice to the community prior to filing an ENF. So something like that could work here as well. But the point again is the applicant would seek input from the affected community to identify what community concerns they have about the proposed project. And under the current MIPA protocol, the pre-filing notification is required at least 45 days prior to filing. And, we're certainly looking for input from you all in terms of what a adequate time frame would look like for an air permit where a cumulative impact analysis is going to be conducted as well. Next slide. And as mentioned in that earlier graphic, the applicant would then assess baseline community conditions. So they would collect data on the environmental, health, and socioeconomic indicators that would go into the baseline assessment to characterize the affected community and create a baseline of current conditions. And this would, part of the process here would be to increase transparency so that the applicant, as well as the community, as well as DEP is aware of what are the challenges faced by any community, what are the indicators and characteristics of the community. And a baseline is also important because it establishes a starting point in an assessment of project impacts. So if there's a project that's going to emit air pollutants, how is that going to affect any of the factors in the community? And it identifies the existing burdens and vulnerabilities. These indicators would include things like existing levels of pollution, health vulnerabilities, as well as other stressors. And again, later in the presentation, APT is going to report back on these indicators. And because we would be requiring the upfront community engagement, community input would inform the baseline assessment. Next slide, please. And then, based on the information that's gathered, the applicant would analyze the cumulative impacts of existing and added air pollution and focusing on the air quality indicators that are closely related to air pollution impacts, because the primary impact from the proposal would be air emissions. And these could include the existing air quality and air quality related health risks in the affected community, presence of other sources of air pollution, population sensitive to air pollution, health vulnerabilities of the affected community. Today, there is, when applicants look at the impacts of their air emissions, they do air dispersion modeling. Sometimes they do risk characterization. So some of these steps could be included here. We are still working on what exactly this would be. And the non-air quality indicators also would be considered. And again, we're still working on developing this, but this section would really be the heart of the analytical work and analysis of the impacts. And next slide. And then the process from there would be similar to what we conduct today. After conducting the cumulative impact analysis, the applicant would file the air permit application with DEP, including the analysis report and any work that's been done. MassDEP would notify the affected community of the availability of the application and begin review. And the community can review it concurrently with MassDEP and submit comments to MassDEP to consider. After MassDEP's review, as we do today, MassDEP would issue a proposed permit decision, and that would go out to formal public comment. Currently, for air permits that do require comment, there's a 30-day public comment period, but we're looking for feedback on whether that would be sufficient for permits that have a cumulative impact analysis, whether it should be longer. And then after the public comment period, MassDEP would issue a final permit decision, which would be, approving the permit or approving it with conditions or potentially denying. So this is really just a high-level overview, and I want to just stop here to take questions on this overall, steps and process for the cumulative impact analysis. And you can raise your hand or you can type into the chat as well. So does anyone have any questions they want to ask, or are we seeing anything in the chat? Colbie?
Glenn, I'm not seeing anything. Oh,
okay.
We do have a question now. Catherine, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute now. Catherine, you're able to unmute.
No, I had to find me. I had scrolled all the way down. So my name is Kathy Robertson, and I am the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Chemistry and Technology Alliance. And first, I do want to, thank everyone who participates in these calls, particularly MassDEP, for the thoughtful approach to this and all the input that has been received. MACTA and its members do support environmental justice initiatives and welcome the opportunity to engage with our neighbors in the community at large. In fact, many of us already do that. I do have a question about the timing of the CIA and the public notification. One of my members expressed a little bit of concern about tipping their hand to competitors, not to their community. Again, we welcome community involvement, and a lot of us already do that, but we're talking about a pretty significant, time increase, especially if we extend the public comment period between when someone actually, wants to apply for a permit and when that decision is already made. Does that change much? Would that be a consideration? Again, this has nothing to do with community involvement. It just has to do with, letting your competitor know that you're going to expand a plant or install a new process or something like that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, at some point, anyone who's going to apply for an air permit is going to have to let the cat out of the bag, so to speak,
right,
and make it public. So I think, currently, as in, just for example, in the MEPA process, they're requiring a pre-filing notice that's 45 days in advance. I don't know if that's, what time frame we would use, but that doesn't seem to be too much earlier time. So I guess it would be case by case. I don't know what the concerns are of the persons you've talked to, but I think eventually it's going to be made public. So I think any person who's going to be expanding can certainly do a lot of work on their own before making it public. But at some point, it's got to be made public, and we would want to see the community involved. They would have to be involved prior to, actually putting the permit application together, because in order to conduct the cumulative impact analysis, that's going to require at least, touching base with and trying to obtain what are the concerns of the community.
And just to clarify, Glenn, first of all, thank you for all the work you've done on this. You've been amazing. But I guess that, I just wanted to say that, there's absolutely no problem with giving the community advance notice. In fact, one of my folks is working on a permit right now, and they are going through this process anyway, because it's a smart thing to do. You don't want to blindside your neighbors. You want people to be involved. It's just sort of setting up some sort of long timetable that, just when determining the timetable for pre-notification, public pre-notification. We have no problem with pre-notification. We know that everyone's going to know about it at some point. And we have no problem with extra time for, community input. It's just, making sure that, there's, that there's a balance there, I suppose. But thank you.
Yes, yeah. And I know when MIPA went through its process, it had had I think a time frame between 30 and 60 days, and MIPA ended up putting 45 days in their protocol. And the good thing is that that's effective now in the MIPA process. So there'll be road testing pre-notification over there. So and they'll be evaluating that. So we hopefully will get some feedback from that being implemented. But certainly we're looking for any kind of concerns or comments on what timeframes proponents might think are appropriate. I think there's something in the chat. Will MassDEP have parameters for the applicant's CIA process? Yes, we will. We plan on developing, specific requirements for the cumulative impact analysis process that would be laid out in the regulations. And, I anticipate we would also have guidance documents as well.
Glenn, I just got another comment in the chat. An audience member asked, how does the applicant know or determine who in the community to choose to involve in the pre-application process?
Right. That's a great question. I think the one way, which is spelled out in the MIPA pre-public involvement protocol, is to there's a list that's being developed by the environmental justice director. So that would be one source. And I understand there's a list of community-based organizations that an applicant could reach out to. The other way to do that is to contact local officials in the town who may know about it. So I think we would put together, guidance and lists of organizations that could be contacted. And that's already being done in the MIPA context that would provide help to applicants to know who to reach out to.
Thank you, Glenn. I'm not seeing any other hands raised or messages to myself, so I think it's okay to go and move on.
I do see one other question in the chat. Oh, never mind. Are we good, Colbie?
Yes, seeing no other hands raised or messages to me.
All right, great. Then I think I'm going to hand it over to Apt Associates.
Next slide, please. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa McDonald, and I'm the project director for the Apt Associates team supporting MassDEP on the cumulative impact assessment. Today, I will be presenting an update on the indicators that we have been evaluating for use within the CIA. Next slide, please. At the November stakeholder meeting, we presented an initial set of indicators, and we asked you all for input on additional indicators that we should consider. To date, we have evaluated over 80 indicators in this process for inclusion within the CIA. Next slide. We originally organized the indicators into 3 general categories: environmental, health, and demographic socioeconomic indicators. Since then, we've added a 4th category, climate, And that was partially based on the input that we got from all of you during the last meeting. Next slide, please. If you remember from the November stakeholder meeting, we evaluated each of the indicators according to 5 criteria, including data availability, appropriate geographic scale, appropriate time frame, redundancy, and whether or not the indicator was quantitative or qualitative. Next slide, please. As I've already mentioned, we started with a list of over 80 indicators, and we've screened those indicators down using the evaluation criteria. At the end of that process, we still have 44 indicators that we're evaluating, and we've now grouped those indicators into 2 groups. The first group is what we are calling baseline community conditions indicators. These are indicators that directly describe air quality conditions or other environmental, health, demographic, and social economic characteristics that describe the community surrounding the air permit facility and are prevalent in other EJ tools and evaluations. The second group we've called supplemental indicators. These are indicators that can also be used to further describe the baseline community conditions. For example, if through community engagement, it is learned that a particular environmental concern that is represented by a certain indicator is important, it can be included within the baseline assessment. There are other indicators that may be useful for describing specific sites or locations, or perhaps were brought up again in a community engagement situation, and also can be used to describe those baseline conditions. The list of indicators presented here is not meant to be exclusive. I also wanted to point out that the indicators presented here today are not final, and you still have time to provide us with comments and questions as we continue to evaluate them for inclusion in the CIA. I'm now going to go through those baseline and supplemental indicators as they are being developed. Next slide, please. Again, we have 4 categories of indicators that we have been evaluating and can be used to describe the baseline conditions in the community surrounding the air permit facility. The demographic social economic indicators, which include social, economic, and statistical data describing the population living in a specific geography. The health indicators assess the existing health in a specific geography. The environmental indicators assess existing sources and amounts of pollution and areas of environmental degradation or contamination. And the climate indicators assess the potential for climate-related stressors and mitigators in a particular area. Next slide, please. The social, economic, and demographic indicators include the indicators identified in the state of Massachusetts environmental justice policy that was updated in 2021. The EJ populations are defined as neighborhoods which include US census blocks that meet one or more of the following criteria: low income, minority, and English language isolation. Sorry about this. The sensitive receptor sites are institutions or facilities that temporarily or permanently house people who could be sensitive to air pollution and other environmental burdens. These include schools, daycares, long-term care facilities, and subsidized and public housing. These are proximity-based indicators that can provide information on sensitive and vulnerable populations to air pollution. In addition, we've included unemployment and education, which are social economic indicators that are widely used to assess vulnerability or disadvantaged populations in other EJ tools. The final indicator that we've included here is the Social Vulnerability Index, which was developed by the Center of Disease Control and the Agency of Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. It includes 15 variables from the US Census to assess a community's vulnerability and resiliency to natural and human-made disasters. The 15 indicators in the SVI are grouped into 4 themes: social economic status, household composition, race, ethnicity, language, and housing. Each of the 4 themes has its own ranking that indicates vulnerability as well as the overall social vulnerability ranking for each census tract in the US. I'll pause just a minute to see if anyone has any questions on any of these social, economic, and demographic indicators.
Lisa, I'm not seeing any hands raised or any messages to myself.
Okay, let's go on to the next slide then. We have identified and screened environmental indicators that can help assess existing sources and amounts of pollution. The air quality indicators can provide a picture of current levels of air pollution and potential emission sources in a community. This information is very important in trying to assess the baseline environmental conditions. Additional mobile sources of air pollution, such as proximity to bus and train stations or distribution centers, were added to the list of indicators after receiving stakeholder input during the November meetings. Water quality was also added as an indicator after receiving stakeholder input. Issues with water quality can identify areas of environmental degradation and contamination, and water quality issues make communities more susceptible to impacts of air pollution. Thus, we have included them. Next slide, please. There are potential health effects that come with living near emitting facilities or areas of environmental degradation. For example, particulate matter can be released into the air from a power plant during electricity generation. Additionally, the presence of solid waste sites can produce odors and pollutant exposures that affect the health and quality of life of nearby residents. The proximity of these areas facilities should be considered when assessing baseline community conditions. And data on most of these indicators is available in the DPH EJ tool. I'll pause again to see if anybody has any questions on the environmental indicators.
Again, Lisa, not seeing any hands raised or questions to myself.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide then. We've identified several health indicators for the baseline community assessment. The first four you see here are indicators. The first four indicators are part of the Massachusetts 2021 EJ policy, and they're indicators of health vulnerabilities in a community. The other four indicators were also chosen because they provide more information about baseline community health conditions. Health indicators such as asthma, COPD, and COVID-19 can be directly affected by increases in air pollution and serve as indicators of sensitivities in potentially affected communities. Other indicators like heart attack and premature mortality rates provide measures of overall community health conditions. The vulnerable health indicators are available in the DPH EJ tool, and others are available in the Massachusetts mapping tools. CDC also provides data on some of these indicators. I'd like to note that the COVID and the premature mortality rates are two of the indicators that were added to the list after the stakeholder meeting in November. And I'll pause one more time to see if folks have questions on the health indicators.
Again, seeing no hands raised or questions to myself.
Okay, next slide, please.
Oh, hold on one second. A question just came in. Sorry about that. Kathy, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute.
I thought I just did. Okay. I just had a question on premature mortality rate. Is that infant mortality rate, or is that folks that die before their actuarial, whatever it is, expiration date? Which one is it?
Can I ask one of my colleagues, Beth Reese, can you provide a response to that?
Yes, so that is people who die before the age of 75.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions?
Not seeing any additional questions.
Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, the climate indicators were a new category that we've added, and the climate indicators that can be used to describe baseline community conditions include heat islands and green space and parks. Heat islands were suggested at the last stakeholder meeting, and we felt that was an important indicator to include. Identifying a facility is in an area that is of risk for exposure to extreme heat can provide an indication of the heat-related impacts that are often exacerbated by air pollution. In addition, heat islands are often negatively correlated with tree canopy. Green space and open space and parks, on the other hand, can help mitigate heat impacts, air pollution and noise pollution, and provide recreation and physical activity opportunities. I'll pause just for a second and see if anybody has any questions on these indicators.
I'm not seeing any hands raised or questions via the chat.
Okay, next slide, please. The next slide, 2 slides provide some additional information on the supplemental indicators that could be used to describe baseline community conditions. Again, these indicators could be included if through community engagement or other information reveals that there's additional information needed to be evaluated. Next slide, please. Some of the supplemental indicators in the social, economic, and demographic categories include age, these include age, which is both the prevalence of younger and older populations in the affected community, as well as the prevalence of immigrant or foreign-born and disabled populations. We could also include crime rates, including violent crime rates, could be included. The assessment of access to healthcare, including proximity to healthcare facilities and health insurance, has been shown to be associated with health outcomes. Access to quality foods or the prevalence of food deserts is considered a social factor of health in the Massachusetts Health Equity Task Force report on health equity and could be associated with poor or fair health. Housing fuel use can impact indoor air quality and provide an indication of the prevalence of populations that are already exposed to indoor air pollutants. And it could also be considered. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my mouse today. Okay, next slide. This slide presents the supplemental indicators for environmental health and climate. For the environmental, the neurological hazard index is included, which can address stakeholder concerns about neurological risks. For health, mental health was also suggested in the last stakeholder meetings. Mental health can be included as a baseline indicator as it provides an important measurement of existing levels of psychosocial stress in a community that may be affected by the siting of additional facilities. And for climate-related stressors such as flooding threats and land covers can also be included as baseline indicators. Both were suggested at the November stakeholder meeting. Okay, next slide. So I'll stop and see if anyone has any other questions on the indicators before I turn it over to my colleague, Michelle Krasnick.
Jimmy has their hand raised. Jimmy, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute.
Hi, Lisa. This is Jimmy from GES. So I might be getting a little ahead of myself here, but you know, regardless of what indicators are eventually chosen to factor into the EJ designation, I'm wondering, you know, this is a ton of data that is dynamic and changing. I'm wondering what is the plan for maintaining such, a complex data set and complex and dynamic data set after, kind of the baseline is established, is there going to be like an annual reevaluation of the EJ areas? I don't know if that's, I'm getting ahead of ourselves here, but that seems to be a pretty significant task that will have to be tackled on a routine basis. And I'm wondering what the plan is for that.
I don't, yeah, go ahead. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Hi, this is Glenn. That's a good question. A lot of these, a lot of this data is publicly available, and I think it needs to be readily available for someone to do a cumulative impact analysis. And as we know, it's these data fields are updated on a periodic basis. Some things are updated annually, but I think in general, the expectation would be you would develop your baseline assessment and do your cumulative impact analysis on the data that is available at that time. Obviously, the data is going to change in the future, but this is for a single CIA permit application. But I think there are discussions within state government on how to make sure we are updating the data in whether it's in our Mass Mapper or the DPH EJ tool or the the EJ tool that that we have. So keeping that data up to date is going to be something that we'll be working on. And then some of the data is based on census data as well, and so that's got its own schedule as well. But I think in general, when you put together, permit applications or do studies, you're using the data that's available at the time. But it is a task that will have to be undertaken to update the data over time. Hopefully that somewhat answers your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. There was a comment from an audience member. Someone said they do not see cancer as an indicator.
Yeah. If there's, and I know cancer was an indicator that was brought up at the last indicator, or I'm sorry, the last stakeholder meeting. If you do not see an indicator on this list, it's likely that it did not pass it's because it did not meet one of the criteria, the 5 criteria. I can't tell you for sure what it is about cancer that did not meet those criteria. But if you have questions on an individual criteria, feel free to ask a question. You can send an email later, and we can certainly go back and revisit that and get you the information on why that is not included here.
Thank you, Lisa. Chris has their hand raised. Chris, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute, please.
Okay, thank you. So Chris Aberg, I'm with Eastman Chemical Company, and I'd be one of the people charged with helping submit and prepare air permits for one of our Massachusetts sites. So I'm looking at the list of indicators, and these are all very important pieces of information. And I'm just thinking about the how. I know that there's a meeting later on. I would just ask for a little bit of help or guidance from MassDEP on where to find these pieces of information. I think that would be important both for the applicant to make sure that we have a technically or administratively complete application to you all, but in addition to that, also for consistency across applications. It sounds like some of these things are tracked in a variety of places. At present, I wouldn't know where to find things like heat islands and green space and access to healthcare, food deserts, or housing fuel use. So just again, making sure that we've got the right places to be looking, and at least maybe some guideposts or some road signs that say, go here to find this. I think that's going to be very important as these sorts of things get pulled together into applications. Thank you.
Yeah, Chris, that's a good point. And, that was one of the criterion was, accessibility of the data. And we want to make sure that that it's clear where to get the data and, so that applicants can pull it together.
Thank you, Glenn. Kathy has their hand raised. Kathy, I'm going to ask you to unmute, please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I have a question and a clarification. The clarification is that, just to understand this better, the indicators will be used to ascertain that these are issues the community faces. The applicant will not, and I'm saying this as a statement, but it's really a question. The applicant will not be charged with resolving some issues like, being a heat desert or having food instability. They just would factor that in when coming up with their CIA as something that contributes to the overburdened conditions of the community, correct?
Yes. These are issues, in an air permit, we can't solve some of these questions. The air permit is focused on, whether an air permit how it should be issued, whether it should be issued, and what conditions and emission limitations. But a lot of these indicators are, indicators of, community vulnerability. So that they serve that function, and how those get taken into account is something we're still, wrestling with, and how does that happen? But the expectation is not that, an air permit is going to solve many of these social issues and justice issues. However, the air permit should take into consideration the context of those issues.
Okay.
And so that's the idea.
The other thing that was raised was is there a way possibly to have a calculation methodology so there'd be a clear numerical representation of like how much each indicator is weighted? So, that would help with that would sort of create a quantitative rather than a qualitative approach, and it would give industry something it could do. And then if industry was looking at mitigation, if the community, for example, is a heat desert, maybe, and there were, the facilities working with the community, they can talk about, planting trees or contributing to farmers markets or things like that as mitigation measures. Is there a way to take some of the more qualitative indicators and try to make them a little more quantitative?
Yeah, I mean, we've looked at that, and we're considering a number of different approaches. Some other states that use these types of indicators do have scoring systems, but they're used for a different purpose. But that's a good point that you raised. And in addition, the mitigation factor, as I was mentioning earlier, an air permit can't really solve some of these problems. But to the extent that this process leads a facility to work with the community and offer mitigation, that would be something that would be a positive. So that's a good comment to make. And we are looking at the various scoring systems and whether and how that should be included in this our process.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Lisa. I'm not seeing any other hands raised or any messages to myself. So I think it's...
Hey, Colbie, can I just
Yes.
offer one clarification on the question about cancer? I left out that we do have lung and bronchial cancer as indicators. So I just wanted to make sure that I didn't miss that. So some cancers are included in the indicators that we have so far.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. Let's go ahead and proceed.
Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Krasnick from Apt Associates, and I'm a senior associate with the Apt Associates team that's helping with this process. And today I'll be presenting a comparison of indicators included in EPA's EJ screen, in Cal EPA's EnviroScreen, and the current proposed list of MassDEP air permitting indicators that Lisa just presented. Both EJ Screen and Cal EnviroScreen were presented in a previous stakeholder meeting, but I will briefly describe them here. EJ Screen is an EPA tool that combines environmental and demographic indicators, and it can be used to identify geographic areas meriting further review, outreach, or analysis. And Cal EnviroScreen is an EPA tool that includes 21 indicators to assess both pollution burden and population characteristics. The indicators that are included in these two tools were selected using similar criteria to what we use to evaluate the potential indicators for the MassDEP air permitting process. And on the next few slides, we will compare the indicators in EJ Screen, in the EJ Screen tool, the Cal EnviroScreen tool, and then the current working list of MassDEP air permitting indicators. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to have the next few slides are going to be tables that look similar to this, where we're comparing indicators, again, between Cal EnviroScreen, EJ Screen, and the MassDEP air permitting process. And for any indicators that we've included kind of in that supplemental list of indicators that Lisa presented, we have an asterisk here in the MassDEP air permitting column. This slide shows the socioeconomic and demographic indicators that are included in Cal EnviroScreen, EJ Screen, and the MassDEP air permitting process. And as you can see, most of the MassDEP demographic and socioeconomic indicators are also included in EJ Screen and Cal EnviroScreen. And in addition to that, MassDEP indicators also include disabled populations, social vulnerability index, and crime rates, and these which were not included in the other two tools. Next slide, please. This next slide shows sensitive receptors and access to resources. For the sensitive receptors, most of this information is also included in EJ Screen, but not in Cal EnviroScreen. I do want to note that we have these asterisks on the EJ Screen column here, this double asterisks. These are indicators that are not currently included in the EJ Screen tool, but they are proposed to be included in future tools. So we just wanted to differentiate that here. We have also proposed to include daycares and preschool facilities as indicators for the MassDEP air permitting process to indicate sensitive receptors. Food deserts and food security and healthcare indicators are proposed to be included in the next iteration of EJ Screen, as I mentioned before, and they are also included in the MassDEP air permitting, proposed air permitting CIA indicators. Cal EnviroScreen does not include these sensitive receptors in access to healthcare, food, and open space. Next slide, please. This slide shows the environmental indicators that are included in Cal EnviroScreen, EJ Screen, and the MassDEP air permitting process. As you can see, the current proposed list of MassDEP indicators align well with the indicators from both Cal EnviroScreen and EJ Screen. In addition, the proposed MassDEP indicators include additional air pollution focused indicators such as additional criteria pollutants and the proximity to mobile sources of air pollution. I also do want to point out that in terms of the cancer question that came up earlier, this air toxic / toxic health risks, that includes the NADA cancer risk indicator as well. So that's another way at getting at cancer risk as well. Next slide, please. Okay, the indicators on this slide are focused on identifying proximity to emitting facilities or areas of environmental degradation. And again, the indicators included on the current list of the MassDEP indicators align well with both Cal EnviroScreen and EJ Screen, and also include additional indicators that represent potential areas of degradation, such as large fuel depots, wastewater treatment plants, and energy and generation supply locations such as power plants. Next slide, please. All right, this slide shows a comparison of health indicators. I do want to note that both that asthma, heart disease, and life expectancy, those should have an asterisk, a double asterisk here. Those are not currently included in the EJ screen tool, but they are proposed to be included. And again, the indicators that were proposed indicators included for the MassDEP air permitting process do include, do align well with the Cumulative screen and EJ screen indicators. And we've also included COPD, and here we have the lung and bronchus cancer rates again, COVID-19 and mental health as well. And I do want to note that mental health was an indicator that came up during the stakeholder meetings. Next slide, please. And here we have a comparison of the climate-related indicators that are included in the MassDEP air permitting. So the MassDEP air permitting, the current proposed indicators include heat islands, lane cover, and flooding threats. Open space and parks have also been considered in this category as well. EJ screen includes a number of the flooding indicators, as well as indicators that are proposed to be included in the next iteration of EJ screen, which are wildlife hazard potential and drought. And those are two indicators that are potentially going to be included in EJ screen. And so I'm going to pause with questions here. But that's like I said, we were just presenting a comparison of the indicators that are currently proposed with the MassDEP air permitting process to Cumulative screen and EJ screen, just to see how these three different tools compare. And I will pause for questions now.
And this is just a friendly reminder for audience members. If you do have a question, please raise your virtual hands or send myself, Colbie Richardson, a message via the chat, and I'll do my best to unmute you. And Rick has their hand raised. Rick, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hello, thank you. I was wondering if being right under an airport runway met with any consideration or might.
So we do have proximity to airports as a potential indicator that you might have seen listed there. As Glenn stated before, we're not quite sure how these indicators are going to be used and how they're going to be factored into the permitting process quite yet. So I can't give you a yes or no answer, but that is something that is being taken into consideration, given that the proximity to an airport is an indicator that we're currently considering. So possibly.
Okay, Michelle, at this time, I'm not seeing any other hands raised or any other questions via the chat.
Okay, thank you. And then with that, I'm going to shift over to Joanne Morin, who's going to continue the presentation.
Yes, good afternoon. So I'm Joanne Morin. I'm the Deputy Director of the Air and Climate Division, and I'm just going to do a little bit of wrap up for today's presentation. So we have next steps. Our next meeting, as Christine indicated, what is going to be in March. The two meetings will be on March 22nd and 23rd, as will be listed on our website. We have a number of future topics for March and also our April meeting that the areas that we'll be working on, further work in terms of developing the cumulative impact analysis, what permits will require the CIA, how to assess indicators, how to analyze project impacts, and of course, permit decisions. All those topics I'm sure everyone will interested in, and we hope you will continue to be engaged with us, and we'll see you at the March meeting. I'm not sure all of these topics will be at the March meeting, but those are future topics for our next couple of meetings. As before, we are doing a Survey Monkey, and we'll have in our further table, but the link is also on this slide for further input. If you want to think of something further after the meeting, or there is something you didn't say during the meeting and would like to include it in the survey, we will have a survey after the meeting for your further input. And that will also be available on our website. So here is the table. We've had this before. It has the various pieces of information you need to be involved in our process, as well as the MIPA process. For comments and input, MIPA has moved into a new stage. They submitted their regs at the end of the year that were due, and now they're doing a phase 2 and have an advisory committee involved in that. And you can get more information on that on this first link. Our comments and input, that is our website there, and that's where you'll also find the link to the survey, which is also at the bottom of this table. Our distribution list, if you're not already on it, if you come to a meeting, we actually put you automatically on it, but if anyone wants to make sure you're on it, or anyone asks you, that's the second link. And then our website is on the third link there. So we also have done this before, is that when you leave the meeting, there'll be an automatic, it will send you to an evaluation page. If you'd like to give us immediate feedback on this meeting, there's a couple of quick questions on what you thought about the meeting and how it was run, if you'd like to give us any feedback on that, so we can continue to improve and get immediate feedback from you. So again, we would like to thank you for participating. And I thought I had one more slide here at the end for any last questions, but maybe I didn't. But we want to thank you for participating, and we would like to ask before we leave if there are any last questions about any of these links. I think, Colbie, there's something more in the chat, but if anyone has any questions at this time before we finish our meeting today. Is there something in the chat, Colbie?
I shared the link to the SurveyMonkey survey in the chat, so it is clickable. I'm not seeing any other hands raised or direct messages to myself, Joanne.
Okay. Okay, we all want to thank you for participating today. We really appreciate you all being engaged, and we look forward to seeing you again, and we encourage you to continue to provide us input, and please use the survey to continue to do that as you think about this presentation. It will be posted on the website if you'd like to see the video, or just relook at the slides. And they are, there were some drafts, there was slides posted yesterday, but we'll post the final slides as well, which are identical except for the link to the survey. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of your afternoon.